Welcome to the new episode of History of Revolution. How are you? Hope your week was fine.
Doing well, thanks. Ready to get into it.
Great. Today, we are undertaking, well, a really critical and frankly quite a painful deep dive. We're looking into one of the 20th century's most profound political tragedies, the failure of the Russian Revolution to achieve its socialist goals and, the rise of Stalinism that followed.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to move beyond just telling the story. We want to provide you, the listener, with a clear, rigorous, analytical framework, a Marxist framework for understanding these events.
That's the goal.
How did the world's first worker state degenerate, starting around, 1921 onwards? How did it turn into something completely unforeseen, this bureaucratic autocracy?
That really is the central paradox, isn't it? It's what some of our sources call the counter-revolutionary revolution. It's a powerful phrase.
It captures it well.
It really does. It suggests a revolution that, turned on itself. It devoured its own promises, twisting those initial socialist foundations into an apparatus of, profound totalitarian exploitation.
So the sources we're drawing on today.
We're primarily looking at analytical works, historical critiques, things like Max Shachtman's The Bureaucratic Revolution, and also writings from the debates within the Fourth International. They all grapple with one key theoretical question that emerges from that period, from 1921 onward.
And what is that key question? Lay it out for us.
It boils down to this. What was the actual class nature of the Soviet state under Stalin? Was it still fundamentally a worker state, just, politically damaged or deformed?
Right, like it had the right bones but was sick.
Sort of, yeah. Or had it fundamentally changed its DNA? Had it generated a wholly new form of class rule, a totally new system of exploitation? And you see, the answer to that question changes everything, especially when you think about revolutionary strategy around the world.
That feels like the absolute crux of it. Because, if it was just a political setback, maybe a temporary dictatorship, something like that, then perhaps internal party reform could have eventually fixed it, right?
That would be the hope, yes.
But if it was truly a new system of class rule, well then, any political strategy aiming for genuine socialism had to face a much harder reality.
Exactly. It meant recognizing that nothing short of a new proletarian revolution would be needed to actually overthrow that system.
A complete reset.
A complete reset. And the conclusion that emerged from this really painful analysis was that Stalinism had indeed generated a new social system. It's often called bureaucratic collectivism.
Bureaucratic collectivism.
Meaning a new exploiting and ruling class had actually emerged. And this realization forced many revolutionaries to confront the darkest prognosis of socialist theory. The ultimate choice, socialism or barbarism.
Ah, right, that fundamental alternative.
Exactly. The great socialist thinkers, when they were analyzing the decline of capitalism, they warned. They said if the working class fails to seize command, fails to reorganize society on socialist principles, the result wouldn't necessarily be just more capitalism. It could be regression.
Falling back.
A descent into what they called barbarism. And Stalinism, which arose precisely from the failure of the World Revolution to spread beyond Russia, it came to be seen by many as the cruel modern realization of that very prediction.
So not quite capitalism, not feudalism, but something else. Something new and terrible.
Precisely. It wasn't a return to the past. It was a uniquely horrific 20th century form of, you could say, state-managed barbarism.
Okay, let's move into the core of that debate then. It seems like it often hinged on interpreting Leon Trotsky, right?
Yeah.
He was the most famous intellectual opponent of Stalinism from within the original Bolshevik leadership. How did he initially frame the problem?
Well, Trotsky's initial hypothesis, which was held by many revolutionaries for quite a long time, was fundamentally rooted in economics. He argued that the Soviet Union, deep down, remained a worker state. And why? Because its economic foundation, the nationalized property established by the October Revolution, hadn't been overturned. That basic structure was still in place.
So the state owned the factories, the state owned the land.
Correct.
And for Trotsky, that meant the form of property was still essentially socialist, or at least post-capitalist, even if the state controlling it had become tyrannical.
That was the essence of the argument, yes. The bureaucracy, in this particular view, was seen as a parasitic layer. He called it a caste.
A caste, not a class.
Right, a crucial distinction for him. It was usurping political control, enjoying enormous privileges. Trotsky himself, I think it was in The Revolution Betrayed, acknowledged what he called a masked appropriation of the product of the labor of others. So he saw the theft.
He wasn't blind to the exploitation.
Not at all. But crucially, Because this bureaucracy hadn't established a system of private, legally recognized property forms, like shareholders owning stock or landlords owning deeds, they weren't considered a new class in the traditional Marxist sense.
So more like thieves who had taken over the house the workers had built rather than builders of a fundamentally new kind of house.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually.
Yeah.
Yes. They were managing and stealing from nationalized property, not owning private property. That was the line for Trotsky.
Okay, let's pivot then. Let's look at the counter-analysis. The argument that said, no, the bureaucracy was a new ruling class, and this system was bureaucratic collectivism. How did they argue against that point about nationalized property? How did they refute the idea that nationalized property automatically guarantees a worker's state?
Well, they essentially rejected the premise that the legal form of property was the only deciding factor. That was too narrow, they argued. Their point was, by controlling the state, and the state owned everything, the bureaucracy therefore controlled the entire productive apparatus of the country. They directed the economy, they decided who got what, and through that total state control, they became the effective economic masters of society.
So ownership by the state became ownership by the bureaucracy that ran the state.
In practice, yes, that was the argument.
Huh?
They established a new social system based on this collective bureaucratic control, a system built on totalitarian exploitation. And the evidence for this wasn't just in legal forms. It was in the brutal reality of life.
Let's break down that brutality then, because that's where this barbarism thesis really seems to take physical form, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
You have to look at the modernization drive under Stalin, the incredibly rapid industrialization of the first five-year plan. Our sources note, and it's a stark point, that this was carried out more completely and exclusively at the expense of the working class and peasantry than was the case in the worst periods of primitive accumulation in any Western capitalist country.
That term, primitive accumulation, it sounds a bit academic. Can we maybe break down what that actually meant? How brutal was this exploitation in real terms for ordinary people?
Right, okay. Primitive accumulation is basically the historical process where the initial capital for capitalist development is gathered. In the West, this involved things like the enclosure movements forcing peasants off the land, colonial plunder, the slave trade, incredibly violent processes.
Okay.
But the argument here is that what Stalin did was even more compressed and ruthless. It meant building up industrial capacity by squeezing every last drop of surplus value out of the working population, forcing consumption down to the absolute bare minimum, sometimes below subsistence.
And crushing any opposition.
Completely. Yeah. Eliminating all political opposition, all independent trade unions, any way for workers or peasants to resist this process. In the West, early capitalism was brutal, no doubt, but it often unfolded over centuries. There were sometimes, spaces for resistance, legal challenges, slow development of workers' organizations.
But under Stalin?
Under Stalin, this whole brutal process was compressed into maybe a single merciless decade. It involved the effective internal enslavement of the working class through impossible quotas and harsh labor laws. It involved the massive, systematic use of forced labor. The Gulag system wasn't just for political opponents, it was a major economic engine.
Millions of people.
Millions. And the systematic destruction of basic human rights and dignity, all sacrificed for the sake of state-mandated growth targets. This sheer scale and intensity of violence and exploitation, they argued, wasn't just a policy choice, it was the defining characteristic of this new social system. It was barbarism, just a modern, state-directed form.
It seems like we're hitting a really fundamental theoretical point here. It explains why just having nationalized property wasn't enough to keep the revolution on track. It comes down to the nature of class power itself, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This is really the cornerstone of the whole argument differentiating the bureaucracy as a new class. And it's worth slowing down to make sure we get it. We have to look at the difference between how the bourgeoisie, the traditional capitalist class, rules, and how the proletariat, the working class, has to rule.
Okay, so let's use those historical analogies the sources mentioned first. They talk about periods like Bonapartism in France or Bismarckism in Germany. What's the point there?
Right. In those cases, you had political regimes, Napoleon III, Bismarck, who were strongmen, often running quite dictatorial states.
Yeah.
They weren't necessarily run directly by the big capitalists themselves. Sometimes they even clashed with parts of the bourgeoisie.
But the capitalists still held power.
Exactly. Despite not having their hands directly on the political steering wheel all the time, the bourgeoisie maintained its social rule. Why? Because its power rests fundamentally on private property. The capitalist class still owned the land, the banks, the factories, the mines. Their economic power, their ownership, is embedded in the structure of society
Hmm.
that sustains their social power, even if the political regime changes form, even if it becomes a dictatorship that isn't directly theirs.
Their power is kind of baked into the economy itself.
That's the good way to put it. It's
Yeah.
social, it's inherent in the economic structure, but the proletariat is totally different. The working class, by its very definition, owns no means of production, no factories, no land, nothing significant.
Right.
It is, as the sources emphasize, nothing without its political power. The only way the working class can exercise class rule, the only way it can actually determine the conditions of production and build towards socialism is by controlling the state democratically, meaning controlling the police, the courts, the administration, having the real power to organize, to debate, to make decisions collectively through democratic institutions like workers' councils or Soviets. That direct political control is their form of class power.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this. If the capitalists lose direct political control for a while, they still own the property, so they retain social power. But if the workers lose political power, if they lose the ability to organize, to dissent, to actually control the state apparatus,
Yeah.
what happens then?
They lose everything. They lose their class rule. They lose their ability to shape their own destiny and the direction of society. If the political power of the working class is systematically destroyed, if their unions are crushed, their parties banned, their democratic organs dismantled, then the workers' state is destroyed in reality.
Even if the state still technically owns the factories.
Even then. Because that nationalized property, which was supposed to be the economic basis for socialism and workers' rule, simply becomes the economic foundation for the power and the wealth of the new ruling elite, the bureaucracy. They wield the state, and through the state, they wield the economy against the workers.
Wow. Okay, that's a massive conceptual takeaway then. Property forms aren't the whole story. The destruction of workers' political power, which happened gradually but decisively after 1921, meant the destruction of the workers' state in everything but name.
That's the core of the bureaucratic collectivism argument. It was a gradual but ultimately complete process of political and therefore social dispossession of the working class. If the state is ruled by an autocratic clique, a bureaucracy, that subjects the working class to relentless exploitation and denies them all democratic rights, well, that state, in reality, cannot be defined as a worker state, regardless of what the Constitution might say. It's become something else entirely.
Okay, let's transition now from the theory to the actual historical process. How did this degeneration happen? You mentioned the original Bolsheviks, Lenin included, were always pretty worried about the revolution surviving if it stayed isolated in Russia.
Oh, absolutely. Deeply pessimistic. They were quite certain, and said so repeatedly, that the revolution would eventually perish if the world revolution, particularly in advanced countries like Germany, failed to come to its aid.
And what did they think would happen? How would it perish?
They mostly expected that isolation would lead back to capitalism, maybe through internal forces like richer peasants gaining too much power, or perhaps through direct foreign military intervention crushing the revolution.
But that's not quite what happened, is it?
No, it was different, and perhaps stranger. The decay of world capitalism after World War I was actually so profound, and the major capitalist powers were so mired in their own crises and rivalries that they couldn't effectively unite to crush the Soviet state in its vulnerable early years. They tried with the intervention during the Civil War, but failed.
So instead of being overthrown from the outside by capitalism,
The revolution essentially corrupted itself from the inside. It perished by degeneration, as the sources put it. It morphed into this unique, non-capitalist but still brutally exploitative totalitarian form, the Stalinist state. The internal factors, the isolation, the terrible poverty and backwardness, the exhaustion after years of war and civil war, all created the conditions for the bureaucracy to gradually consolidate its grip.
what were some of the practical signs on the ground? The mechanisms that showed workers were actually losing control in their workplaces and communities?
Well, look at the factories, for instance. After the Civil War ended, around 1921, there was initially a system you could call factory dual control, although it was already quite limited.
Dual control.
Yeah, you'd typically have a party representative, sometimes called a koziestvenik,
Yep.
basically an economic manager appointed by the party working alongside a technical director. Often this director was an engineer or specialist from the old regime, kept on because they had crucial technical expertise that the Bolsheviks initially lacked.
So there was some tension there, some potential check.
There was potential, yes. It allowed for some level of friction, maybe some minimal worker input filtered through the party cell, even if it was heavily constrained by the party hierarchy. But the bureaucracy, as it grew stronger, started to squeeze that out. That system of dual control essentially vanished pretty rapidly between, say, 1928 and 1929, right at the start of the massive, frantic push for industrialization under the first five-year plan.
And what replaced it?
It was replaced by a new, much more homogeneous class of managers, the so-called red specialists. These were individuals, often trained quickly, whose loyalty was primarily to the burgeoning state and party apparatus and to fulfilling the centralized economic plan, not necessarily to the working class or the old ideals of workers' democracy.
So one-man management, loyal to the top.
Essentially, yes. The old engineers were either pushed out, subordinated completely, or sometimes even arrested during the purges. The bureaucracy was asserting total, unquestioned command over industry directly in its own hands.
Now, let's talk about the peasantry, a huge part of the Russian population. They supported the revolution in 1917 against the landlords, but you mentioned earlier they sort of became a pawn later on. How did that work?
Yeah, the peasantry's role is really complex and ultimately tragic. Their position was always contradictory in Marxist terms. In 1917, they were crucial allies of the proletariat. They wanted land, the Bolsheviks promised land, so they rose up against the feudal landlords. That was the alliance.
But after the Civil War?
After the Civil War, and especially as the struggle heated up inside the Bolshevik Party between the left opposition, led by Trotsky, who were pushing for more workers' democracy and international revolution, and the rising bureaucracy around Stalin, well, the bureaucracy cleverly utilized the peasantry as a political tool.
How so? In what way?
Initially, they played on the aspirations of the better-off peasants, the so-called kulaks, and the general desire for stability after years of chaos. They used these sentiments to politically weaken and isolate the revolutionary proletarian core within the party of the opposition.
Portraying the opposition as dangerous radicals.
Exactly. As being too focused on workers' issues, too focused on global revolution, maybe hostile to the peasants' immediate interests, or to the small-scale private trade that was happening under the new economic policy, NEP. They used the weight of the peasantry, politically speaking, to help crush the left opposition, the vanguard of the original revolution.
But there's a terrible irony here, isn't there?
A profound irony. The sources really emphasize this, because the peasantry paid an absolutely horrific price for this temporary tactical alignment with the bureaucracy. As soon as the left opposition was effectively silenced and eliminated politically by the late 1920s, and then physically in the purges, the bureaucracy turned its full unrestrained force onto the peasantry itself.
This is the forced collectivization period.
Yes. The brutal, forced collectivization drives of the early 1930s. Yeah. This resulted in what the sources call the enslavement on the land. It led to mass famine, particularly in Ukraine, the Holodomor. Millions died. The destruction of livestock, the deportation of kulaks, and even middle peasants. It was catastrophic. The bureaucracy, having used the peasantry to consolidate political command, now ruthlessly seized the last vestiges of economic independence from the entire rural population, forcing them into state-controlled collective farms.
It's just layer upon layer of betrayal.
It really is.
And what about the Communist Party itself, the CPSU? It was supposed to be the engine of the revolution, the vanguard. How did it get transformed from that into, as you said, the party of this new ruling class?
The transformation was, again, systematic and utterly ruthless. It wasn't an overnight coup, but a grinding process throughout the 1920s, accelerating dramatically into the early 1930s. The original core of the party, the people who'd made the revolution, fought the Civil War, many of them dedicated working-class militants or revolutionary intellectuals, this core was rapidly diluted.
Diluted how?
By flooding the party with new members. People who weren't joining out of revolutionary conviction, necessarily, but often seeking career advancement, administrative positions, privileges in the new state apparatus, and simultaneously, the old guard was being systematically eliminated.
Through the purges.
Through arrests, executions, exile, imprisonment in the gulags, or just political marginalization and silencing. Stalin's Great Purge in the mid to late 30s physically liquidated almost the entire generation of original Bolshevik leaders who were still alive.
So it sounds like a complete structural takeover from within.
It absolutely was. And a key step, organizationally, was the elimination of the old statutory guarantees. These were formal rules that had been put in place earlier, specifically designed to try and ensure a working-class majority, or at least a strong proletarian character, within the party ranks.
And they got rid of those.
They were abolished. The sources are very clear on this point. By the time this process was complete, the CPSU was no longer, in any meaningful sense, a workers' party. It had become, quote, the party of the new ruling class, the collectivist bureaucracy.
So who made up the party then?
It became the party of the officials, the managers, The administrators, the military officers, the police apparatus, the entire ruling stratum that benefited from the new system. It was the instrument of their collective control, not a vehicle for workers' liberation.
And Stalin's personal role in all this, was he the mastermind, the architect of this new system, or was he more of an instrument himself?
The analysis strongly suggests he was primarily the instrument, albeit a very effective and brutal one. Stalin wasn't really the great theoretician of the revolution like, say, Lenin or Trotsky. His strengths lay elsewhere. He was a master administrator, a patient organizer, and an absolutely unsurpassed political intriguer.
Skills useful for a bureaucracy.
Precisely. He was pushed to the forefront by the rising bureaucratic clique because his specific characteristics, his utter ruthlessness, his organizational skill within the party machine, his deep-seated paranoia and suspicion, his ability to build a fiercely loyal personal faction based on patronage, all these made him the ideal representative, you might say, for the needs of this emerging ruling group.
The man for the job, however dirty.
Exactly. He was perhaps the only one capable, and certainly willing, to carry out the necessary, incredibly bloody work of physically destroying the entire revolutionary vanguard of 1917 and consolidating the bureaucracy's absolute totalitarian grip on power. He served their interests, even as he terrified them.
Okay, this is where it gets, well, even more complex, perhaps. How did the internal nature of this bureaucratic state, this unique exploitative system, how did that start to manifest itself in its foreign policy? How did it shift from being supposedly the center of world revolution to acting on the global stage?
The shift was really total, and it reveals the deep inner logic of the bureaucratic regime. The early ideals of the Third International, promoting global liberation, were completely jettisoned in practice. Instead, the Stalinist state began to act much more like a traditional expansionist territorial power, driven by its own interests, not international solidarity.
And we saw this leading up to World War II.
Absolutely. Consider the immense effort, the unbelievable sacrifices, the brutal repression imposed on the Soviet population for years, all supposedly in the name of preparing for the inevitable war, especially against Nazi Germany. Industrialization was geared towards military buildup.
Yet when the invasion actually happened in 1941,
The military and political structure, despite all that preparation, almost collapsed entirely in the initial months. The failure was catastrophic.
and the German Wehrmacht penetrated deeper into Russia than any previous Western invasion ever had, deeper even than Napoleon. That level of failure, despite the industrial power built on the backs of forced labor, it really says something about the system, doesn't it?
It speaks volumes about the internal contradictions, the inefficiency, the brittleness, the fear and lack of initiative inherent in that top-down, terror-driven Stalinist command structure. It wasn't a system that fostered resilience or competence, despite its outward appearance of monolithic strength.
But the people fought back, fiercely.
They did. And this is the great, tragic paradox of the war on the Eastern Front. The population, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, others, they resisted the Nazi invasion with incredible determination and sacrifice. But our sources strongly argue that this determination often stemmed from a deep, visceral hatred of fascism, from patriotism, from attachment to their soil and their homes. It was often in spite of the Stalinist regime's incompetence, its brutality, its ideological bankruptcy, not because of it.
So they were fighting the Germans, but not necessarily for Stalin.
In many ways, yes. The analysis suggests the average Russian worker or peasant essentially postponed settling their own accounts with their rulers in Moscow until the immediate existential threat from the Nazi invaders was removed.
And moving beyond just defense, what about the regime's own expansionist actions? The Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939 seems crucial here.
Absolutely crucial. Under the cover of that pact, the bureaucracy didn't just gain breathing space. It actively acquired territory. Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, parts of Finland and Romania.
So much for socialism in one country.
Exactly. This proved pretty conclusively that the official ideology was just that ideology, a cover. It didn't actually inhibit the bureaucracy from coveting vast foreign territories and populations and acquiring them through military force and cynical deals, acting just like any other expansionist great power. Its only limit was the resistance it met from other powers. Hey, listener, do you have any other idea or question about this? Please write in comments.
By the way, if you liked and interested so far, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. It's really important for us to continue this series.
Okay, so after Hitler broke the pact and invaded, the Soviet Union found itself in this very strange alliance with the major Western capitalist powers in the US and the UK. How did those dynamics work? It seems like an alliance born purely out of necessity, not shared values.
Oh, is deeply cynical, absolutely driven by the mutual enemy. But what's really fascinating, according to the analysis we're looking at, is the underlying point of unity between the Stalinist bureaucracy and the Western capitalist leaders, people like Roosevelt and Churchill. Unity. What could they possibly agree on, besides beating Hitler?
Their fundamental shared goal, beneath the surface, was actually counter-revolutionary. It was to suppress the potential for popular, potentially socialist revolution across Europe that they all feared would emerge from the chaos and exhaustion of the war. They wanted to ensure an orderly transition from war to peace.
Orderly meaning preventing the masses from taking power themselves.
Precisely. They wanted political stability, which meant controlling the situation, managing the post-war settlement from the top down, and crucially, suppressing the revolutionary aspirations of the European working classes and resistance movements who had been radicalized by years of war and occupation. They were united against popular revolution.
So, on the surface, allies against fascism, but underneath, a kind of unholy alliance against the working class potentially taking control.
That's the argument, yes. However, layered underneath that shared counter-revolutionary aim, there were obviously massive conflicting imperial ambitions about how the post-war world, particularly Europe, should be divided up.
The spoils of war.
Exactly. Russia, the Stalinist state, driven by its own bureaucratic needs for security, resources, and strategic depth, wanted a sphere of influence. It sought a continent divided into preferably weak, friendly buffer states under its domination, ensuring none were exclusively controlled by the West.
And the US and the UK, what were their aims?
The United States, which emerged from the war as the overwhelmingly dominant economic and financial power, aimed for its own kind of domination, financial and economic penetration of the entire continent, opening it up for American capital. Britain, by this point, was more of a junior partner to the U.S. in this project.
So, immediate conflict baked into the alliance itself.
Absolutely inevitable. Every agreement they signed during the war, Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, was fraught with these underlying tensions and conflicting aims. They essentially contained the seeds of the future Cold War hostility. The sources argue that the conditions for a potential Third World War were being laid almost before the second one had even officially ended.
And for the people living in those territories that were annexed or fell under the control of the Red Army after the war, what did Stalinist domination actually mean?
Well, from the perspective of the working class in those areas, it simply meant trading one form of oppression for another, replacing Nazi occupation or pre-war authoritarian regimes with a new form of totalitarian exploitation and slavery under the bureaucratic boot.
And what about the local communist parties in those countries or in Western Europe? How did they fit into this picture? Were they genuinely fighting for workers' interests?
According to this analysis, no, not in a way that leads to liberation. The leaders of the local CPs, especially in Western countries, are described as being, yes, deeply hostile to capitalism, but ultimately anti-proletarian in their fundamental aims.
How so?
They're characterized as political careerists. Their real ideal wasn't workers' democracy or self-emancipation. It was establishing the exact same kind of totalitarian bureaucratic regime in their own countries as existed in Moscow.
So they looked to the Soviet Union as a model.
Absolutely. They didn't view the Red Army invasions of Eastern Europe with dread or as a betrayal of socialism. The sources say they viewed these invasions with admiration and envy because the arrival of the Red Army immediately facilitated the transfer of state power into the hands of the local Stalinist candidates who could then begin building their own totalitarian rule.
Right. That paints a very grim picture of the communist parties outside the USSR, and it leads us directly to the organized opposition to this new form of barbarism, the Fourth International. Tell us about its formation.
Well, the Fourth International, the NFI, was essentially born out of this desperate necessity. The realization that the original Revolutionary International, the Third International, or Comintern, founded by Lenin, had become completely corrupted.
Corrupted how?
It had transformed from an organ of world revolution into basically just an instrument of Stalin's foreign policy interests, defending the Soviet bureaucracy's needs above all else. So a new, clean banner was needed. Trotsky's speech in October 1938, formally marking the founding of the EFI, was really a crucial declaration. It said the original institutions of the revolution were dead, corrupted beyond repair, and a new international organization based on the original principles had to be forged.
And this organizational break, creating a new international, must have required a fundamental shift in strategy, especially regarding the Soviet Union itself, right? What was the debate there among the anti-Stalinist revolutionaries?
Yes, that was central. Initially, back in the 1920s, even early 30s, there were still debates within the left opposition about the possibility of reform within the USSR. Could the party somehow be corrected? Could the bureaucratic apparatus be pushed back by the healthier proletarian elements within it?
The idea of fixing it from the inside.
Kind of, yeah. But as the degeneration deepened, as the terror became absolute, as the purges consumed millions, including most of the oppositionists themselves, and as the exploitation became so total, that idea of reform was definitively abandoned by Trotsky and the movement he founded.
So the conclusion was that the state had changed too fundamentally. Reform was no longer possible.
Exactly. The conclusion became stark and unavoidable. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, was no longer a worker state, however deformed. It was a new, exploitative, counter-revolutionary regime. And therefore, a second, new proletarian revolution was necessary inside the USSR to overthrow this autocratic system entirely and establish genuine workers' democracy on the basis of the nationalized property.
A political revolution, they called it sometimes.
Yes, a political revolution to overthrow the bureaucracy, not a social revolution to overturn the property forms, but a revolution nonetheless. To keep advocating for mere reform at that point meant clinging to the fiction that Russia was still some kind of worker state, a position that became strategically and theoretically bankrupt.
Okay, and what were the critical political implications of this analysis for revolutionary movements operating outside the USSR in the capitalist countries?
This is a really vital point, especially for listeners trying to understand the political landscape of the 20th century. The sources warn very strongly against the danger of mischaracterizing the Stalinist parties outside Russia, the local CPs in France, Italy, Britain, the US, etc., as just being, a particularly militant left wing of the existing labor movement.
Why is that view considered so dangerous? They were often involved in unions, they fought fascists, they certainly opposed capitalism.
They did those things, yes.
Yeah.
But the danger, according to this analysis, lies in misunderstanding their fundamental nature and allegiance. The argument is that classifying them as simply a left wing is based on a mistaken theory, namely the old idea that the Soviet Union was still fundamentally progressive or a worker state. And this mistaken classification leads directly to political confusion and strategic disaster for genuine revolutionaries.
Disaster happened.
Because if you see them as just another part of the workers' movement, you might form alliances with them or fail to politically combat their influence effectively. But if you understand them correctly, as agents of a foreign, totalitarian, counter-revolutionary bureaucracy,
And they're an enemy.
then you recognize that their ultimate allegiance is not to the self-emancipation of the working class in their own country, nor to genuine socialist democracy. Their allegiance is to the ruling bureaucracy in Moscow, and their political goal is ultimately to replicate that totalitarian structure wherever they can gain influence or power. Therefore, they represent an existential counter-revolutionary threat within the workers' movement itself, a threat that must be fought politically just as fiercely as traditional capitalism or fascism.
So Stalinism, in this view, kind of exploits the genuine anger workers feel towards capitalism.
Exactly. It exploits that justifiable antagonism, channels that energy, but directs it towards a political end, the totalitarian bureaucratic state, that is fundamentally anti-socialist and anti-proletarian. It's a trap.
Okay, let's push the timeline forward now. We get to the post-Stalin era. Stalin dies in 1953. What happens immediately to the power structure? Does the system change?
Well, the most immediate effect was that Stalin's absolute personal dictatorship instantly broke down. You couldn't survive him. The whole environment at the top became much more fluid and unstable, as the sources put it. The bureaucracy, which had itself suffered immensely under Stalin's paranoid terror, remember, even top officials lived in constant fear of the purges, began to assert itself and consolidate power more as a collective class, rather than everything depending on the whims of a single terrifying despot.
And we saw this playing out in the power struggles, like with Khrushchev eventually coming out on top, but the methods changed, didn't they?
Yes, and that's a critical shift to note. First, you see the swift execution of Beria, the hated head of the secret police, by his own colleagues in the leadership. That was the bureaucracy collectively striking back against the instrument of terror. Then, when Malenkov falls from power, the sources note it happens with no bloodletting.
A big change from Stalin's time.
A huge change. It showed the bureaucracy developing a kind of collective courage against the worst excesses of the personal despotism they had all endured. Khrushchev eventually managed to sideline and remove all the other prominent figures from Stalin's inner circle, Malenkov, Molotov, Kaganovich, Bulganin, but significantly, unlike Stalin, he didn't resort to mass blood purges against his demoted rivals. They were generally retired or sent to minor posts.
So the system found a less lethal way to manage its internal personnel issues, making life safer for the bureaucratic elite itself. But the fundamental question remains, did the exploitative character of the system change? Did life improve significantly for the working class?
That's the crucial question. And the answer, according to this analysis, is found not just in the absence of mass terror, but in the grand pronouncements and, more importantly, the actions of the new leadership.
You mean like Khrushchev's big speech about building communism?
It's exactly. In 1961, Khrushchev unveiled this ambitious new draft program for the Communist Party. It boldly announced that the building of communism, using Marx's definition, the higher stage beyond socialism, the end of the state, the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, was now the immediate practical task for the Soviet people. It was presented as the glorious culmination of the whole revolutionary project.
Sounds impressive, but what was the critical response from the opponents of the regime, like the Fourth Internationalists?
The critique was absolutely blistering. They characterized the entire program as essentially more fraud and deceit.
Why? What was fraudulent about promising communism?
Because while it dangled the prospect of material abundance sometime in the distant future, the entire focus of the program, its real content, was about justifying and perpetuating the totalitarian rule of the bureaucracy in the here and now. The key thing missing, any actual democratic guarantees.
Nothing about workers' control or political freedom.
Absolutely nothing. The sources point out there wasn't a single word explaining how it was possible for a homicidal madman like Stalin to rule unchallenged for decades, using mass terror against his own party and people. Not a word about the ongoing role of the secret police, the KGB, in maintaining the system's control. The promise of future communism was just seen as a new ideological fig leaf to cover the reality of ongoing bureaucratic dictatorship and exploitation.
But perhaps the ultimate, the most decisive proof of the real limits of this post-Stalin de-Stalinization wasn't a party program, but a concrete historical event, wasn't it?
Without a doubt. The Hungarian Revolution in 1956, that was the acid test.
What happened there?
It was a genuine popular uprising. It started with students and intellectuals, but quickly spread to the working class across Hungary. They were rising up against the local Stalinist dictatorship imposed after the war and against Soviet domination. Their demands were for genuine socialist democracy, for workers' councils to run the factories, for national independence, for political freedom. It had incredibly widespread support.
And how did Khrushchev's supposedly reformed, de-Stalinized regime respond?
They responded with tanks. The uprising was swiftly, perfidiously, more pitilessly, more brutally suppressed by force of arms, ordered by Khrushchev himself and the Moscow bureaucracy. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest and crushed the revolution in blood.
So much for the thaw. That moment seems to deliver the final political judgment on the real nature of the post-Stalin bureaucratic state, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The message sent by the crushing of Hungary was loud, clear, and unambiguous. Reforms, yes. Freedom, no. The bureaucracy proved that while it might allow some easing of the terror, some minor improvements in living standards, perhaps some cultural liberalization, it would never voluntarily yield the absolute political power that was the basis of its collective economic rule over society. Any challenge to that monolithic political control would be met with overwhelming force.
And there's that interesting historical paradox mentioned in the sources, drawing on thinkers like de Tocqueville about what happens when oppressive regimes try to reform themselves slightly.
Yes, it's a really crucial insight for understanding revolutions. De Tocqueville observed, studying the French Revolution, that the sufferings that are endured patiently, as being inevitable, become intolerable the moment it appears that there might be an escape.
Meaning hope makes oppression worse?
In a way, yes. When a long-standing totalitarian or oppressive regime starts to attempt reforms, even minor ones, it doesn't necessarily pacify the population. Instead, it can inadvertently signal weakness or raise expectations and make the remaining oppression feel all the more unbearable. The glimpse of potential freedom highlights the existing servitude.
So the bureaucracy, by trying to make small, controlled changes to stabilize its rule after Stalin, actually risked lighting a fire.
Precisely. They risk precipitating exactly the kind of revolutionary crisis, like Hungary, that its forces might not always be able to swiftly contain or repair. The reforms, far from guaranteeing stability, could actually expose the fundamental illegitimacy of the regime and fuel the desire for complete change.
Wow. This has been an incredibly detailed and, yes, quite a grim journey through the collapse of the hopes of 1917 into this totalitarian, exploitative reality. As we wrap up, let's try to synthesize the two biggest historical lessons that our listeners should take away from this deep dive, based on the sources we've discussed.
Okay. I think the first lesson is perhaps the most fundamental, theoretically. It's that the proletariat, the working class, absolutely must achieve and, crucially, maintain its own independent political power if it wants to secure its social rule and move towards socialism.
Political power meaning?
Meaning real democratic control over the state, the ability to organize freely, to debate, to dissent, to make decisions collectively, to directly determine the conditions of production through its own institutions. Economic changes alone, like nationalizing property, are simply not enough. They're necessary, perhaps, but not sufficient.
Because if the proletariat loses that political command,
then its economic gains, like nationalized property, are immediately turned against it. They become the economic basis for a new exploitative class regime, like the bureaucracy. Political power is paramount for a class that owns no property.
Okay, that's lesson one, the primacy of workers' political power. What's the second key takeaway?
The second lesson is more about understanding the specific, unique historical outcome of the Russian crisis. It's that the failure of the world revolution to spread, combined with the specific conditions of Russia and the decay of world capitalism at the time, led not to a simple restoration of capitalism as many initially expected.
But to what?
But to this unique and uniquely brutal form of exploitation, the new barbarism of Stalinism or bureaucratic collectivism, whatever term you prefer. This historical reality forever challenges any simplistic, dogmatic adherence to rigid historical formulas. It demands a constant, critical, concrete Marxist analysis of the actual changing state of the world, not just applying old blueprints.
And critically, even after Stalin's death, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall much later, the sources we've looked at suggest that the core underlying problems that fueled these 20th century crises, they remain largely unresolved, don't they?
They absolutely do. The general decay of capitalist society, the inherent drive towards crisis and conflict, continues, sometimes hidden, sometimes bursting into the open. The fundamental problems that fueled the Second World War, the intense imperial rivalries between great powers, the competition for resources and global domination, the exploitation inherent in the system, these were never truly solved. They just took new forms during the Cold War and continue in different ways today.
Creating ongoing danger.
Leading directly to the conditions for perpetual conflict, instability, and the constant danger of new, potentially even more devastating, wars. The fundamental struggle remains, just as those original revolutionary sources warned decades ago, a struggle between the potential for genuine socialism, a society based on human need and democratic control, and the ever-present threat of barbarism in various forms. And the triumph of socialism, they argue, is only possible through the conscious action, the self-organization, and the revolutionary struggle of the international working class itself.
It leaves us with a lot to think about, the continuing relevance of these struggles. Thank you for guiding us through this incredibly complex and challenging history and theory.
Thank you. It's crucial history to grapple with.
Indeed. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for this intense deep dive into the history and theory of the counter-revolutionary revolution. We really hope this has provided a clearer framework for thinking about the tragedies and the lessons of the 20th century. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you on next episode, comrades. Bye-bye.